Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the latest episode in our lockdown series of Meet the Author events, the GLAS Hour as we're calling it. First off, I'd like to thank those of you who've continued to contribute to the Edith Wilkins Foundation for Street Children in Darjeeling. We've received some very generous donations over the last week, amounting to over €3,000, so we're very grateful for that, as indeed are the staff and the children at the residential centre in Darjeeling. So it's my pleasure this afternoon here, as it is here in Geneva, to introduce to you our next guest. He's a very distinguished author, diplomat, and academic. Professor Kishore Mahbubani has been listed as one of the top 100 public intellectuals in the world by Foreign Policy and Prospect magazines. He was also on a Financial Times list of top 50 individuals who would shape the debate on the future of capitalism. In short, he is a global thinker who also has a wealth of practical experience in the world of diplomacy, including periods as permanent secretary at the Singapore Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He has been Singapore's permanent representative to the United Nations and served as president of the UN Security Council in 2001 and 2002. Professor Mahbubani is best known outside Singapore for his books Can Asians Think?, Beyond the Age of Innocence, Rebuilding Trust Between America and the World, and The New Asian Hemisphere, The Irresistible Shift of Global Power to the East. His writing has appeared in Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, The Washington Quarterly, Survival, American Interest, Time, Newsweek, the Financial Times, and the New York Times. So you're very welcome, Kishore, to the GLAS Hour.
My pleasure to join you.
It's great to see you. Before we get into this fantastic book, Has China Won? I thought it'd be interesting for our viewers to hear something about your own background. I believe you're not a Singapore native as such.
My parents came from Sindh in Pakistan, but I was actually born in Singapore in 1948. So I've had the great privilege of having many different life experiences and also living through many different eras. So when I was born, for example, Singapore was a British colony. For the first 15 years of my life, I was a British subject, although that doesn't allow me to claim British citizenship now. And then I grew up after 2 years in Malaysia in an independent Singapore. So I've experienced the world of British colonial era. I've experienced a poor third world childhood. So I was in a special feeding program, and I was 6 years old when I went to school because I was technically undernourished. Now you can see I'm overnourished. And then of course, I've lived through the great transformation of Singapore and of Asia, because what Singapore has become today is beyond any of the wildest dreams that I ever had for Singapore.
What do you attribute that success, the success of Singapore?
I think, it's a combination of factors. And I would put it, if I ask me to name two key factors, I would say leadership and luck, L&L. Leadership, because the first generation, the founding fathers of Singapore, especially three gentlemen whom I work with very closely, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, Goh Keng Swee, and Rajaratnam, I have somewhat recklessly claimed that they were as brilliant as, if not more brilliant, than America's founding fathers. Now that's a huge claim to make, but I'm happy to defend that. And then there's of course also luck. They had the right policies, but it so happened that Singapore became independent at a time when Southeast Asia was very important to the United States. So the United States was pouring in resources and materials, and more than that, investing in Southeast Asia. So to give you one simple statistic, by the way. The United States has invested more in Southeast Asia than China, Japan, South Korea combined. That shows you the remarkable amount of investments American made in South. So we rode that, I would call that wave of American investment and involvement in the region, but that was luck, of course. And then, of course, the second wave came along, which we can talk about.
But why in particular would America choose to invest so much in Singapore? Is it the location, or is it something about the people in Singapore, hardworking?
Well, I think actually, the figure I gave earlier was for Southeast Asia, but the United States actually invested more in Singapore than in the rest of Southeast Asia. It's amazing. Singapore is only 5 million people. But I think they've invested in Singapore because, people who invest, let's be very clear about this, don't do it for altruistic reasons. They want to make money. And especially you want to be sure that if you put in, let's say, $500 million to building an oil refinery, the payoff will come over 30 years. So you need to ensure that the country you're investing in will be stable over 30 years. There are very few countries that can provide. Switzerland is obviously one of them, but Singapore is another one of them. So when you invest your money, if you put in $1 billion, it's safe for 30 to 40 years. That's a remarkable asset that actually Singapore shares with Switzerland.
How is the economy coping with the COVID-19 pandemic?
Well, it's a two-part story, because if you look at the data, Singapore seems to still be producing numbers of 500 to 600 to 700 people being infected every day. But actually, Singapore's population, if you look at the long-term resident population, the citizens and permanent residents who make up 3.7 million people, from that population today, for example, we only have 2 cases. But then we have a small slice of what you call foreign workers who work in construction sites, who come from South Asia, from China. These people, because they live in very tight, dense dormitory spaces, there has been an outbreak among them. So most of the cases of COVID-19 we are getting is from a small sliver of the population, the foreign workers, who actually live quite apart from the rest of Singapore. So in the Singapore population at large, Singapore has done a remarkable job in terms of reducing the number of incidents in Singapore. And by the way, Singapore has done an equally noble and generous job of taking care of its foreign workers too, because the Prime Minister of Singapore very generously gave an assurance to the families of these foreign workers and told them that, please don't worry, we will take care of your husband, your brother, your son, your father. We will take care of them. And that's a very generous gesture.
Is there any concern about their working conditions or their living conditions?
Oh, I think we have discovered clearly that their living conditions need to be improved. And that I see as one of the results that's going to come out of this lessons from COVID-19. Clearly, we cannot go back. COVID-19 has been such an amazing event. I think it's going to change the course of world history in many ways. And countries like Singapore, Singapore can only survive, I must emphasize, by being open to the world. Our total trade is 3.5 times or 3 times the size of our GNP. So if you're not open to the world, we die. So in the same way, if you're going to remain open, you've got to make sure that any vulnerable sectors of your society, like the foreign workers, need to be protected in the next challenge from COVID-19.
Are you facing the prospect of a recession in Singapore?
Of course.
How bad,
if you have an open economy, there's no way you can avoid a recession. But at the same time, Singapore is a very blessed. I mentioned our founding fathers. And one of the wisest things that our founding fathers, Lee Kuan Yew, Goh Keng Swee, and Rajaratnam did was to keep on reminding Singaporeans, you must always save for a rainy day. So as you know, the United States of America lives beyond its means and is borrowing from the future to take care of its current needs. We don't do that. We use the savings of past generations to take care of the current generation. So Singapore's savings are among the highest in the world. So I don't think we will have any challenges coping with any kind of short-term recession. That is, of course, happening now.
Do you think it's going to be a short-term recession?
Well, I would say by short-term, I meant 2 or 3 years, not 2 or 3 months. But even if it's 5 years, and frankly, I'm not sure that I should say this, even if it's 10 years, I think we'll be all right. We have saved for a rainy day.
Good to hear. So moving on to the subject of your book, Kishore, Has China Won? I suppose an obvious question to ask is, has China won what exactly?
Well, for a start, I'm not supposed to give you the answer, has China won the question, otherwise you won't buy the book. But nonetheless, I'm a generous soul, I'll give you the answer. The answer to the question, has China won, is no.
My question is, what have they won? What are they trying to win?
I was going to come to that.
Yeah.
And I was going to say not yet. And what have they not won? They have not yet become the #1 economic power in the world. And I think I'm prepared to take a bet with you that in my lifetime, and I'm already quite old, by the way, China will become the #1 economic power in the world. And that's unstoppable. And as you know, the book discusses US-China relations fundamentally. And I think that one of the critical goals of this book is actually to wake up my American friends and say, prepare for a different world. I mean, Americans, as you know, psychologically cannot even think of the idea of American becoming #2. In fact, if any American politician even dares to ask the question, can America become #2, he's toast, right? And it's absolutely heretical. You'd be burnt at the stake, metaphorically speaking, if you as an American politician say, maybe it's time to prepare for becoming #2. But as I document in the book, that's something that is more than likely. So let's think about a world that is very different. And I hope in that sense, I'm being helpful to my American friends to prepare them for realities rather than for them to continue to engage in wishful thinking, which is of course very dangerous.
But what is the real significance of that, of China becoming the world's greatest economic power? I mean, how different is that to the situation we're in today, where America, certainly in terms of soft power, seems to have much more influence in the world?
Well, I would say that, I mentioned how I grew up in the British colonial era when Western supremacy or British supremacy was taken for granted. And it is the texture and chemistry of a world where America is #1, which is what we've experienced now for over 100 years now, is obviously going to be very different in a world where China becomes #1. Now, let me emphasize, I'm not portraying a dark future, but I want everyone to know the most important human statistic of all, which is that if you look back at human history over the past 2,000 years, then for 1,800 out of the past 2,000 years, the two largest economies were always those of China and India. And it's only in the last 200 years that Europe has taken off and North America has taken off. So the past 200 years of Western domination of world history have been a major historical aberration. All aberrations come to a natural end. So that's what we are living through today, and I'm actually very grateful I'm living through one of the most interesting and exciting times in human history. And so we are now leaving the 200-year aberration of Western domination of world history towards, and we are entering a more interesting world, and hopefully a more peaceful, a more civilized world, of what I call a multi-civilizational world, where you don't just have one successful civilization, but you have many successful civilizations. And that makes it a much richer and more interesting world. And so we should be cheering it rather than, like most Americans, dreading the prospect of a world where America is no longer number one.
But does the rest of the world aspire to be like China, a country which has no democracy, has a very repressive approach to freedom of expression and human rights in general? I mean, is that the inevitable downside of becoming the world's number one economic power?
Yeah, actually, I'm very glad you asked that question, because in asking that question, you were putting on lenses from the 19th and 20th century to look at the 21st century. I hope, please forgive me for being so frank with you. I mean, the impression that the many Westerners have, as you revealed in your question, is that the 1.4 billion people in China are suffering so badly because their human rights are being deprived and they're just being oppressed by a wicked, evil Communist Party government. Now that's exactly the black and white world that that we got used to in the 19th and 20th century, which is no longer relevant in the 21st century, because the Chinese are going to make their own choices about what kind of society they're going to have. And from the Chinese point, let me finish. Very important, very important. From the Chinese point of view, when they were weak and disunited, the West never exported human rights to them. The West never exported democracy to them. The West trampled on them. The British forced the Chinese to accept opium in return for Chinese tea. The West seized Chinese territories. The West took settlements from China. The West burned down the Summer Palace. You've forgotten all that. You've forgotten all that. And now you want to come as the saviors of China and say, don't you want a better government? What's wrong with you? You know, that's a sort of condescension that the West pours on China, which frankly is something that the West has got to get used to, the idea of stop doing it, because the Chinese are going to find their own way. And it may certainly may not be as good as the Western way, but it will be the Chinese way. And I also want to emphasize, to answer your question very directly, the Chinese will be very shocked if other countries try to emulate them, because the Chinese, unlike the Americans, don't believe they represent a universal civilization that is relevant to the rest of the world. They say, no. What we are doing in China is good for us. You do what is good for you. We do what is good for ourselves. The Chinese are not exporting the Chinese model to anybody. So you shouldn't feel threatened in any way by the Chinese succeeding in their own way.
Sure, I don't feel threatened at all by China, and I have a lot of sympathy with their history. Being an Irishman myself, I'm quite well aware of the depredations we all suffered under the British Empire, and China as bad as anybody else. And I've been to China and I've enjoyed it very much, and I did not see any signs of, you know, a brutal police state or oppression. People are very friendly, very kind. A great place to play golf, play tennis. You can do all those things. But underneath all that, we have to recognize a reality that, for example, 1 million people are practically incarcerated in China because of their religion. Is that not the case? As Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International are constantly drawing attention to the fate of the Uyghurs in China. I mean, how do you explain that away?
Well, I would explain that away by saying, number one, that China is not perfect. But I'm glad you described the China you had seen, where people are free to do, as you know, what they want to do. And you know, I first went to China, I want to emphasize, in 1980, when the Chinese people couldn't choose what to wear, where to live, where to work, what to study, and the Chinese people couldn't travel overseas. Today, the Chinese people enjoy remarkable freedoms. And you know, each year, 130 million, 140 million Chinese leave China freely and go back to China freely. So I want to, since you talk about 1 million people in China, I think it's important to emphasize that there are 1.4 billion people in China. And many of them, as you can tell, if you've been there, seem not just happy, but are very grateful that their lives are much better than their parents or grandparents who went through hell in the past. And since you talk about the Uyghurs, I actually discussed that issue in my book. And the way I see it is the West is expressing a lot of sympathy for Muslims in China. And of course, the West says we have the moral right to speak about your oppression of Muslims because we treat Muslims much better. So and in the book, I asked a very straightforward, factual, empirical question. If you ask yourself quite simply, the simple question, let's say take the last 20 years, okay? Who has killed more innocent Muslims? Is it China or is it the West? And to give you one statistic, in the last year of the presidency of President Barack Obama, who was a very peaceful president, he dropped 26,000 bombs on 7 countries. Now, and that's why when the United States, and you know, I was in Manhattan when 9/11 happened, and I could understand why the United States reacted so angrily to 9/11, invaded Afghanistan, then invaded Iraq, which was unjust. But the end result was that many Muslims died. Now, I want to emphasize that China also experienced a 9/11 moment, that Chinese were killed in Chinese cities by people from Xinjiang, and they said, this has got to stop. And they have started something which they call a de-radicalization program in Xinjiang. So the West has objected to it. Now the West, very interestingly, since you talk about human rights, the West tabled a resolution, as you know, and the UN Human Rights Commission saying, we are very unhappy. We want to condemn what China has done to the Muslims in China. And what's interesting is that there are 1.3 billion Muslims in the world. They live in over 50 countries. Not one of the 50 countries supported the West in what the West was trying to do in defending Muslims in China. So I think, to put it very bluntly, the rest of the world could see the hypocrisy of what the West was doing. And that's why not a single Muslim country joined in. So my answer to that question is, yes, let us try to help the Muslims in China. But if you posture and you stand on a stool and deliver moral diktats, nobody's going to listen to you, because that's the world of the 19th and 20th century. It's no longer the 21st century. You've got to learn to speak respectfully to other societies and civilizations and listen to them. And that's sometimes very hard for people to do.
Kishore, Human Rights Watch would probably say that the reason why no Muslim country supported that resolution at the Human Rights Council was because they're so indebted to China because of things like the Belt and Roads Initiative, etc., and it's sheer moral cowardice on their part.
Well, that's
many of them privately are very
That's actually not true. Actually not true, because Saudi Arabia is much more indebted to the United States, the custodian of the Holy Mosque. And believe me, the Saudi Arabians rely more on the United States. They're an American ally. UAE is an American ally. Turkey is a member of NATO, you know. So, you know, come on. I mean, that you mustn't allow facts to get in the way of this. The facts are very clear that even the most pro-Western countries did that. And I think it's also a bit, I hope you don't mind me being frank with you, maybe the Muslims can make decisions without being bribed economically. Maybe they have capacity to make decisions on issues without being affected by economic considerations.
Well, I wonder what your reaction is to the following from Kenneth Roth, the director of Human Rights Watch, where he writes that one would have hoped that the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, the group of 57 mostly Muslim majority nations, would come to the defense of the persecuted Muslims of Xinjiang, as they did for the Rohingya Muslims ethnically cleansed by the Myanmar military. Instead, the OIC issued a fawning panegyric commending China for, quotes, providing care to its Muslim citizens. Pakistan, despite its role as OIC coordinator and its corresponding responsibility to speak out against abuses faced by Muslims, has championed such efforts.
Well, actually, Kenneth Roth is a friend of mine.
Yeah.
I know him very well, and I respect him a great deal. And I would say that he's doing very, very noble work. And he's the only one who's actually brave enough to point out, for example, how much Western countries have participated directly in the torture of Muslims also.
There's nobody doubting that, but I mean, we're discussing China.
So I think, no, seriously, it is not, in a sense, it is actually very shocking that the defenders of human rights, United States, Western Europe, have participated in torture. And Kenneth Roth is very brave, I must say. He exposes all this. So I'm making a very simple answer to you, that the violations of human rights are not confined to China.
Of course.
That, and so, for example, I find it quite shocking the cowardice of the European countries who knew exactly what happened in Guantanamo, for example, and not one European government had the courage to condemn the United States publicly when Guantanamo happened. As a student of philosophy, one thing you learn is that in the principles of justice are very clear. Justice must be blind. So if a poor man kills somebody, you sentence him, you send him to jail. If a rich man kills somebody, you sentence him and you send to jail. That's why justice is blind. But the way the Europeans practice human rights, they say, well, if a poor country violates human rights, we condemn them. If a rich country violates human rights in the United States, we look the other way. And that's a violation of the most basic principle of justice, which I learned as a student of philosophy.
Couldn't agree with you more, but I mean, we are talking about China here. We're not talking about, the United States. It's well covered territory. How abominably the United States behaved in Iraq and other places around the world.
We are talking about the United States and Western Europe continuing to pass judgments on China. And I'm sure you heard of the fable of the emperor who's naked. And a child saying, only the child has the honesty to say that the emperor is naked. And that's how the emperor is seen by, as I say in my book, the 6 billion people who live outside the United States and outside of China. So the views of the 6 billion, and what's good about our world is that the rest of the world is now becoming very intelligent, very perceptive, and doesn't buy the black and white judgments that many in the West are passing. So what we are advocating is a world in which we treat each other with respect, and we acknowledge that we are all imperfect. But I can tell you that, for example, to answer your question very directly, I'm pretty confident that within 5 years or 10 years, whatever it is, the 1 million people of Xinjiang will be released from their internment camps. If they are indeed 1 million, I must say I do not know for sure. But if they are, I'd say that they'll be released within 5 to 10 years. Oh. But the 1 million people who've been killed in Iraq, in Afghanistan, you cannot bring them back.
I quite agree with you. Our experience in Ireland that people who are interned without trial usually don't come back as law-abiding citizens. They're usually radicalized by the experience. But we leave that for another day. How can a country ruled by?
Incidentally, that's not true. Just because I know why. Singapore is surrounded by more Muslims than Israel is. Incidentally, we live in an Islamic sea, and there have been successful Islamic de-radicalization programs. So just let me state that as a matter of fact. And if you want to do research, you can find it in Southeast Asia. We have succeeded.
I've no doubt that there have been successes, but it's the failures that I worry about.
Yeah.
Could I ask you, how can a country ruled by a communist party be such a dynamic player on the world stage economically? That seems like a real conundrum for many people.
That's a very, very good question. And I think if you read my book, I have devoted a lot of time to try and explain how is it that the Chinese Communist Party is so successful and so dynamic. And I think one of the key contributions that my book makes is to try and explain who the Chinese really are and what the Chinese Communist Party is really like. And if Lenin were alive today, let's give you a great example. If he visited a party secretary in a province in China, and he said, Mr. Party Secretary, please let me accompany you for the day. And the party secretary will say, oh, can I please, I have to rush to an appointment. The largest investor in my province is, let's say, Foxconn from Taiwan. And they are manufacturing chips that are exporting the rest of the world. They're creating jobs for me. I have to rush to the factory and quickly ask them, how can I help them? And Lenin would say, you are helping capitalists? And he say, of course. That's what the Chinese Communist Party does on a daily basis. So, so if you have a chance, I would say, I gave a lecture also in Harvard on this. And I said the biggest misunderstanding of the Chinese Communist Party, CCP, comes from the fact that it still retains communist in its name. Because the CCP should actually functionally stand for the Chinese Civilization Party. And the goal of the Chinese Communist Party is to remove the century of humiliation that I spoke about earlier and to make Chinese civilization strong and respected around the world, which I think is a reasonable goal to have. And it so happens that they have chosen the Chinese Communist Party. And the people who joined the Chinese Communist Party are not the sort of, ideological apparatchiks that you used to find in the Soviet Union, for example. So when I was doing my sabbatical at Columbia University in January, February 2018, my research assistant, which Columbia University assigned to me, was a very young, very bright, I must say, Chinese lady. And we talked about her life, and she said how sad that she was that she graduated number 2 from high school. So I said, gosh, that's a big deal, number 2. You must be super bright. She said, no, you don't understand. So why not? She says, if you graduate from a Chinese high school, if you're number 2, you don't get admitted to the Chinese Communist Party. Only number 1 does. So her dream as a child was to be admitted to the Chinese Communist Party. So the Chinese Communist Party has actually become one of the most meritocratic institutions in the world. And as I say in my book, the Americans keep thinking that this is a contest within a dynamic democracy and a sclerotic communist party. And in a contest within a dynamic democracy and a sclerotic communist party, of course the democracy is not good. But if you dig down and you see how the two societies are functioning, United States has effectively become a plutocracy, and China has become a meritocracy. So in a contest between a plutocracy and a meritocracy, the meritocracy can win. So that's why it's important to go beyond the external labels and dig deep and understand the nature of these societies that you're dealing with. And that's what I hope my book tries to help a Western reader to do, to understand.
What is it in the nature of the Chinese system that refuses to countenance democracy?
Well, I wouldn't say that they refuse to countenance democracy. I think it's conceivable that China will eventually become a democracy. But, you know, the Chinese have studied the experience of countries that tried to become democratic overnight, either through foreign exports. As you know, the United States as an administration openly said, we are invading Iraq to deliver democracy to Iraq, to remove Saddam Hussein. Now, I hope you can explain to me, if you don't mind. I'm obviously stupid and ignorant. I don't understand Iraqi democracy. If you can explain to me how it works, I'd be very, very grateful, because I don't understand it. The Americans spent $5 trillion to deliver democracy to Iraq, and I'd like to understand how that democracy is working. And similarly, the Russians, when the Soviet Communist Party was deposed, the Russians became democratic overnight, and the net result was that the Russian GNP imploded, life expectancy of people went down, infant mortality went up. As far as I can tell, millions of people suffered. And so when you talk about becoming democratic overnight, which is the expectation of many in the West, the Chinese said, well, we saw what happened to Iraq, we saw what happened to Russia. If you don't mind, we'll just stick to the Chinese way.
Well, even some mild tolerance for freedom of expression or free press, how bad could that be for anybody if it's such a stable society, well functioning, people are reasonably well off? They can't be trusted to express their own thoughts and views.
I'm glad you're raising these questions, which will actually I discussed them in the book, you know. And actually, it was an Indian scholar who said to me once, Pratap Banu Mehta. He said the difference between India and China, and India, as you know, has got freedom of expression, a robust democracy, free press, everything, you know. India is actually the world's largest democracy. And it's an Indian scholar who said to me, he said, sure, the difference between India and China is that India is an open society with a closed mind. China is a closed society with an open mind. And I would say today, vis-a-vis many countries in the West, you have many Western societies which are open societies, including the United States, with a closed mind, because they don't seem to be able to understand how much the world has changed. And the Chinese have a closed society with an open mind. And that's why the Chinese have been delivering a performance that is off the charts. And if you go to China, and I would invite you to do so, I would invite you to go and give lectures to Chinese universities, and I've done quite a bit of that myself, and to meet the students and to see how aware the Chinese students are, what's happening in the world, and you know, even American senators go and speak in Chinese universities. You get a culture shock when they meet students who are so bright, so well informed, and so aware. So the Chinese are not cut off from the world in the way that the Soviet Union was, you know. And as you know, each year, 134 million Chinese leave China freely and travel around the world. I mean, surely when they travel, they hear everything, and they still go back to China. So there's obviously what the Chinese society is delivering to their own people is a very rich life that they are actually enjoying enormously.
I have a question here for you, Kishore, from somebody here in Geneva, I think, Robin Bielik. How do you view recent events in Hong Kong where young citizens have protested the erosion of their freedoms and privileges by the Beijing-oriented government?
Well, I would say the important thing is, this is where it's important to understand the history, which is that Hong Kong is not an independent country. Hong Kong was taken away from China by the British. And when the British ruled it for 150 years, the Hong Kong people never had democracy, not one day. So it's interesting that the British people, who never gave Hong Kong a day of democracy, are now asking, why doesn't Hong Kong have democracy? You know, this is again the sort of hypocrisies that other people see.
Was that not the agreement they came to with the Chinese before they handed over the colony? And it's certainly the understanding of most Hong Kong citizens, if one is to judge them by their actions on the streets, that they're so apprehensive about the possibility of having what little local government and democracy that they do enjoy being taken away from them by this superpower in Beijing.
They are part of China, and they're not an independent.
They must bow the knee to the Communist Party of China.
The point is I guess, you know, in some ways you can argue that perhaps it was a mistake for China to agree to 50 years of autonomy for Hong Kong. That maybe they should have done what India did with Goa. As you know, the British Prime Minister and the United States President called up Jawaharlal Nehru and said, don't invade Goa, which was then a Portuguese colony. And Jawaharlal Nehru said, ignored it and said, this is Indian territory, I'm taking it back. And what's interesting is that China didn't do that. China could have easily invaded and taken over Hong Kong.
It looks to both of us like they are trying to do it.
And so in a sense, China is being punished now for allowing autonomy to Hong Kong.
I would disagree with you.
Let me finish. If you're a questioner and you really want to help the people of Hong Kong, the best way you can help them is to understand that there's some hard geopolitical realities that will not change. And that if you are 7 million people and you want to pick a quarrel with a country you're part of 1.4 billion people, think very carefully. What are the consequences? Will you end up in a better situation? Would the British send their troops back to save you? Would they? Never. So, I mean, this is what, as a geopolitical analyst and a realist, I find that it's always very comfortable to posture and to take, you know, very nice positions. And then at the end of the day, when the people of Hong Kong suffer as a result, you can walk away and say, I'm sorry, that's your problem, no longer my problem. But the people of Hong Kong have to deal with the reality that they are part of China and they have to learn to live. It's going to be very difficult, but let them work it out. And the more you get involved in it, the more complicated it becomes.
I think we can all admire their struggle for freedom and for freedom of expression, no matter what the odds are that are stacked against them. Just as we would admire the struggle of the only Chinese winner of the Nobel Peace Prize, who practically died in jail for his efforts, even though he was a completely non-violent, peaceful protester. All he wanted was the right to express himself, to write his poetry, to write his journalism, and he died for that reason.
But I think to be fair, you should also admire the Chinese gentleman who saved 800 million people from poverty, which is twice the population.
No, of course, nobody.
And I think you would agree with me that the Nobel Peace Prize should have also been given to the person who saved the one human being in the world in human history who actually deserves the Nobel Peace Prize because he's rescued close to 1 billion people from poverty, is Deng Xiaoping. And so far I've never heard any Westerner trying to offer the Nobel Peace Prize to Deng Xiaoping. So why is it why is it you want to focus on where the Chinese have gone wrong?
I'm sure.
Why don't you focus on where the Chinese have gone right?
Okay, let's move to that. What does the response to COVID-19 tell us about what the Chinese are doing right and what the Americans are doing wrong? What does it say about the two systems of government? The Chinese seem to have got a handle on this, and in a way that highlights the inadequacy and incoherence of the response, particularly in the United States, but also in many Western countries?
Well, I would say I think it's premature to pass judgment. That we are still in the thick of battle with COVID-19. The battle is not over. And certainly as of now, there's no doubt that China has done better in terms of managing the issue, because if, let's say, for example, the United States, I think, has had over 77,000 deaths from COVID-19. If the United States had the same ratio of deaths to population as China, the number of deaths in the United States would be less than 1,000. So in that sense, the Chinese have done better. But at the same time, if, for example, tomorrow, United States of America, which has the best universities, the best scientific research institutes, if the United States comes out with a miracle vaccine or a miracle cure, all of us, including myself, will say, thank God we have America. America saved us at the end of the day. So I would say, let's wait and see. We are still in the middle of the battle. But of course, I hope that because we're in the middle of the battle, all of us will come together and fight COVID-19 together, including US and China. They shouldn't be competing with each other to build a better vaccine or a better cure. They should be working with each other because it's a common threat that we face.
But unfortunately, they're not working together. I mean, we don't see the kind of solidarity there was between, and cooperation there was between the Americans and the Soviet Union, for example, when they defeated smallpox. That certainly is not happening now. And it's
that's sad. That's sad.
Yeah. Doesn't it say something about this battle that you hint at in the title of your book? You know, there is a rivalry between these two great nations, which is playing out in a dysfunctional way, and COVID-19 epitomizes that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's actually my book is about. I see a major tragedy unfolding over the next 20, 30 years in the form of a major geopolitical contest taking place between US and China. And I think it'll be very damaging to the United States. It'll be damaging to China. So the goal of my book is actually to avoid this head-on collision and appeal to their common interests that they have. So for example, I say that if the primary strategic goal of the US government is to improve the well-being of the American people, and the primary strategic goal of the Chinese government is to improve the well-being of the Chinese people, they should be working together to improve the well-being of the people instead of fighting each other. And secondly, many of the challenges that we face today are common challenges. COVID-19 is the most immediate one, but we have global warming also that is coming. It's going to be an even bigger challenge, I think, in the coming decades. So I say that if the US and China keep fighting each other while global warming is happening, then future historians will look at them and say the United States and China were like two tribes of apes fighting each other while the forest around them was burning. That we obviously consider ourselves to be smarter than apes. So why don't we use our intelligence and stop fighting each other and focus on the common challenges? And that's the goal of my book. And I hope in that sense, my book will be helpful to both the 330 million people in America, the 1.4 billion in China, and the 6 billion of us who live outside the US and China.
Do you think there's a risk of a military conflict between the United States and China? And if there is such a risk, what do you think might trigger it?
Well, I would say you never say never. But if anybody wants to take a bet with me, I'll happily take a bet. There'll be no direct war between US and China, as there was no direct war between the United States and Soviet Union. Because if you have a war between two nuclear powers, you don't have a winner and a loser. You have a loser and a loser. Both China and the United States will lose, and of course Russia might win, India might win, or Europe might win, but US and China will lose in the nuclear war. So that's why there will not be a war. There will, of course, be military competition. There'll be proxy wars. There might be tense moments between naval vessels in the South China Sea. All that may happen, but I'm reasonably confident that both sides will avoid a direct outright military contest. Anyway, that's not where the main contest is. The main contest, as George Kennan advised when he advised the United States in 1949, will depend on the what he calls the domestic spiritual vitality of the societies. And he said, as long as the United States is a much more vibrant and dynamic society, it will win the contest against the Soviet Union. In the end, it did, you know. So the question today is whether or not American society is more dynamic or vibrant, or Chinese society is more dynamic and vibrant. Of course, Americans assume American is much more vibrant. But United States is the only major developed country where the average income of the bottom 50% has gone down over a 30-year period. In the case of China, the past 40 years, the Chinese bottom 50% have experienced the greatest improvement in their livelihood that they've experienced in 4,000 years. So any future historians will see all this much more clearly than we can see.
What do you make of the relationship between the two presidents, the president of China and the president of the United States? Do you think they have a genuine rapport, or is it all smoke and mirrors? It's impossible to understand what's going on there at all?
Well, I mean, as you know, President Trump, the one leader whom he's been very respectful for, and I think it's a matter of public record, is President Xi Jinping. So I think President Trump, as you know, he might criticize President Macron, he might criticize Chancellor Merkel, but he's not criticizing President Xi. So I think it's important that the two of them still maintain capacity to talk to each other. So I hope that will carry on, because it'd be even worse for the world if, in addition to this growing US-China geopolitical contest, you also had a situation where the two presidents were not able to talk to each other.
Which one do you think has the bigger ego?
I would say Trump wins hands down.
Yeah. How badly do you think it plays with the Chinese people, the constant criticism and insults that the Americans are hurling at them over the origins of the COVID-19 virus? You know, yeah. Accusing them, saying that it has been deliberately released from a laboratory in Wuhan, for example.
Yeah. Well, I would say it's very, very unwise. And in fact, here too, you know, as in my book, I describe how what I'm suggesting for America is the advice that Henry Kissinger gave to me personally when I met him. And then also the advice I took that George Kennan gave to America at the beginning of the Cold War. And he said that if America is going to win the Cold War, it's got to do four things: focus on domestic spiritual vitality, which I spoke about, develop close friends and allies, don't insult the Soviet Union, because we have to work with the Soviet Union, and be humble. And what's interesting is that the Trump administration is ignoring all four pieces of advice, and especially the advice, don't insult your adversary. And I think, but of course, one of the most delicate points I make in my book, which is of course a very delicate subject to raise, is that the reason why many Westerners find it very easy to insult China is because the fear of the yellow peril has been buried deep in the Western psyche, the fear of a yellow man running the world. And so the rise of the China is unfortunately revitalizing the yellow peril dimension, and that's what generating a lot of this very uncivilized insults that are being thrown at China. And one of the goals of my book is to get those in the West to do some introspection and to ask themselves whether it's wise to allow these subconscious drivers of emotion to drive their policy towards China. Because as Freud, as you know, as a student of Freud wisely advised, if you do have subconscious impulses, bring them out and deal with them, rather than them being devils in your mind that are stirring your brain and affecting your attitudes without you being aware of that's what leading you to be so insulting towards China.
Sure. Just before we wrap up, we have a few more questions that have come in from viewers. Irene Zhu, she writes, could you elaborate the merit criteria for joining the Chinese Communist Party? Thanks.
I'm not a member of the Chinese Communist Party.
No
But
one's suggesting you are.
I've actually, you know what? I've actually spoken at the Communist Party school, and at the most senior level, you know, they said these are like almost like vice ministers, governors, and you know the quality of mind of the people that I interacted with in the Chinese Party school was quite stunning. So, and I say in my book that, you know, as you know, McKinsey, for example, McKinsey Consultancy is a meritocracy. You got to be super bright to get in. Harvard University is a meritocracy. You got to be one of the top 3 professors in the world before you can become a professor in Harvard. So in the same way, the Chinese Communist Party is meritocratic in the same way. If you don't have that quality of mind, you don't get promoted to the top ranks of the Chinese Communist Party. So in that sense, it is literally a meritocracy.
As long as you're not pro-democracy. I guess that's what's behind that question. There's a question here from Nick Renton, who's in Wimbledon in London. He asks, what one practical thing could the current American administration do to put its relationship with Beijing on a better footing?
The answer is very simple. Read my book.
Well, that's a great note to finish on, Kishore. And I have to say, I'm very disappointed with Amazon, because when I heard you being interviewed on Australian radio 2 weeks ago, I immediately went on Amazon to order it. And unfortunately, it still has not arrived. So they have to do something.
Well, I would love to get your views on it after you've read it. Please share them.
Well, it's been great to have such an insight into its content and to hear your thoughts on, particularly on the relationship between China and the United States. And can you advise viewers where they can find out more about your work? You have a very good website.
Yeah, mahbubani.net. Yeah. www.mahbubani.net.
Well, Kishore, thank you so much for being so generous with your time.
My pleasure.
Thank you so much. Good night, everybody, or good afternoon, or good morning, and talk to you all in the next week or so. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.